December 17th, 1944. The ground beneath Schönberg, Belgium, trembled like a living thing. Through the frozen fog, Sergeant Curtis Adams crouched beside his gun pit, hands shaking, pencil barely holding steady, writing what would be his final letter home to South Carolina. "They think we cannot fight," he wrote. "Today we'll show them what black artillerymen can do." He didn't know that letter would never arrive. Within 24 hours, half his battalion would vanish into smoke and snow. That morning, the German army launched its final gamble of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. 3 armies, 28 divisions, 250,000 men. Their mission: smash through the thin American lines, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied front in two. And directly in their path stood a single, segregated artillery battalion of the U.S. Army, the 333rd Field Artillery. The irony was painful. Most German officers had been told that black soldiers couldn't fight. They'd been taught that Negro troops lacked courage, discipline, intelligence. They'd been told this by their own propaganda. And, ironically, by American segregation. But in the next 10 days, those same officers would learn how wrong they were. They would watch their own attacks shredded by artillery fire so precise, so devastating, it shattered every illusion they held about race, courage, and war itself. This is their story. The story of men who fought 2 enemies, Hitler abroad and hatred at home. Men who held Bastogne when the world thought they couldn't. Men the history books forgot. Would you have heard of them, if not for one boy, 50 years later, who refused to forget? Beat pause for emotional tone reset. Comment respect if this is your first time hearing the name the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, August 5, 1942. The red dirt roads of Oklahoma baked under the summer sun. Dust clouds followed convoys of Army trucks, heading toward a brand new training post, Camp Gruber. Inside those trucks were 540 black enlisted men and 30 white officers, forming the 333rd Field Artillery Regiment, the U.S. Army called it an experiment, a colored artillery unit. But to the men inside those trucks, it was a test of whether courage, intellect, and precision could break through prejudice. At Camp Gruber, they were greeted not with celebration, but with segregation. Separate barracks, separate mess halls. Even the water fountains carried invisible lines between white and colored. They would fight for democracy, but not share a table with it. Lieutenant Colonel Harmon Kelsey, a career regular Army officer, commanded the battalion. He was white, but unlike many of his peers, he respected skill. And soon, even he would admit privately, "These men are among the sharpest recruits I've ever seen." They were trained on the M1 155mm howitzer A-12,000-pound monster that hurled a 95-pound shell over 8 miles. To make that gun deadly required more than muscle. It required math, physics, meteorology. A single firing solution demanded knowing distance, elevation angle, wind speed, barometric pressure, powder charge, all under the pressure of combat. Miss by 1 degree, and the shell could land hundreds of yards off target. Miss by 2, and you might hit your own men. So, these soldiers, many from small southern schools with outdated textbooks, taught themselves advanced ballistics. They memorized tables, practiced trigonometry, and calculated trajectories on slide rules until their fingers bled from graphite and cold metal. Each gun crew became a single heartbeat. Load, lock, fire, repeat. 11 men moving in rhythm, their timing down to the second. It wasn't just artillery anymore, it was choreography. Range officers soon realized something remarkable. Every battery, Able, Baker, Charlie, Service. Headquarters fired faster, hit closer, and repositioned quicker than expected. 3 rounds per minute. Shift position. Fire again before German counter-batteries could respond. They turned gunnery into an art form. But outside the training fields, they were reminded who they were not allowed to be. When white officers went to town on weekends, black soldiers were told where they couldn't eat, where they couldn't walk, where they couldn't even look. Jim Crow didn't stop at the camp gates, it just put on a uniform. Still, they endured. not because they accepted it, but because they saw through it. They knew they were fighting two wars, one against fascism overseas, and one against the lie of inferiority at home. Private Robert Greene of Georgia would later recall, "We knew one thing if we failed. They'd say, 'See, that's why they shouldn't fight.' So, we didn't fail." The irony was unbearable. While the War Department printed posters preaching freedom and daughters and Falter, democracy, the 333rd had to train under the same laws that Hitler used to justify racial superiority. The U.S. military, fighting a racist empire, still segregated its own soldiers. But something began to happen inside those gun pits, something the Army couldn't quantify. Race stopped mattering. Skill did. The men built quiet pride around precision. They turned every perfect shot into proof. Every calculation became an act of rebellion. Their gunnery scores equaled and often surpassed those of white artillery units training at the same base. Range officers' reports carried a subtle discomfort. Performance exceeds standard expectations. Discipline exceptional. Morale strong. Those words rarely traveled up the chain of command. The Army wasn't ready to publicize excellence that contradicted its own bias. And yet, within the 333rd, belief was growing. They believed that the battlefield, not bureaucracy, would finally prove them right. That somewhere in Europe, they'd get their chance. By early 1943, that chance arrived. The Army reorganized, splitting the regiment into two independent battalions, the 333rd and the 969th, both black under mostly white officers. Their regimental headquarters became the 333rd Field Artillery Group, responsible for coordinating artillery across entire divisions. They were ready. Ready to fight. Ready to prove that freedom didn't come in colors. February 29, 1944. The 333rd boarded troopships bound for England. 12 days across a U-boat-infested Atlantic seasick, scared but unbroken. When they landed, they saw something that would shock them more than any battle. There were no colored-only signs. No segregated barracks. No rules telling them where to sit, eat, or walk. British civilians treated them like soldiers, like men. One private wrote home, "In England, I'm a man. In America, I'm a Negro. But when the shells start flying, I'll just be a soldier." They trained in the English countryside until late June, preparing for the invasion of a continent held hostage by tyranny. And on June 29, 1944, they landed at Utah Beach in Normandy. Their war and their chance to prove the world wrong had begun. June 29, 1944, Utah Beach, Normandy. The tide still carried the wreckage of D-Day twisted steel, burned-out landing craft, shattered helmets, half buried in the sand. Through the smoke and chaos came the rumble of trucks hauling 12,000-pound guns, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion stepping into history. They were the first black heavy artillery unit to set foot on European soil. Within hours, their guns were unlimbered, leveled, and thundering. Shells screamed over the hedgerows toward German positions hidden behind Norman stone walls. Static crackled through the radio. Add 50. Fire for effect. The guns obeyed. Precision thunder rolled across the fields. The 333rd had found its voice. Their orders were clear. Support the breakout from Normandy. Soften German strongpoints. And make way for the infantry. Each firing mission was a race against time. Mathematics under fire. A single miscalculation could wipe out friendly troops. But the black gunners of the 333rd didn't miss. Every round landed where it needed to. And soon, their accuracy became legend among the men they supported. French civilians, peering from shattered windows, saw something they'd never imagined. Tall, determined black soldiers manning enormous cannons, shouting calm, clipped commands as explosions echoed through their valleys. For many, it was their first time seeing people of African descent, at least, not as victims, but as liberators. The German propaganda had told them these men were savages. But now they watched them hand chocolate to children and rebuild fences between missions. One farmer said later, "They were polite, always smiling. They gave my children sweets. I could not believe these were the men our occupiers called animals. But the Germans learned faster than anyone that the 333rd's guns were anything but primitive. Reports from the front described their fire as unnervingly accurate. After-action notes from American officers began to circulate, with one unusual line repeated again and again. Request 333rd for continued fire support. Accuracy exceptional. Soon, across Allied lines, the call became a code. Get the black guns. Not for politics, for results. By August, the battalion was driving deeper into France, their barrels still hot from constant firing. Their next mission, Brest, one of the most fortified cities in Western Europe. 30,000 German defenders, many fanatical naval troops, had orders to fight to the last man. Every road into the port was mined, every bunker reinforced. Tanks couldn't move. Infantry couldn't advance. So the generals called in the 333rd from positions outside the city. The 155 millimeters howitzers began their deadly rhythm. Each 95-pound shell packed 19 pounds of TNT. Each explosion tore through concrete, turning bunkers into tombs. The bombardment lasted days. Night after night, the horizon glowed orange. By the time Brest fell, the city was unrecognizable, and so was the reputation of the 333rd. Infantry commanders submitted their reports. Artillery support from the 333rd met the highest standard of excellence. Morale of troops directly supported by 333rd significantly improved. Even the Army's normally restrained official records couldn't hide. Their fire had been decisive, yet when the guns fell silent and the men were rotated back for rest, the familiar lines reappeared, separate tents, separate dining, separate everything. They could die beside white soldiers, but they couldn't eat beside them. They could liberate a nation, but not their own streets. One private wrote home in frustration, "We can kill Nazis, but we can't sit in a cafe with white Americans." Still, they fought on, because professionalism was its own kind of rebellion, because the best revenge against prejudice was precision. Their daily routine became a kind of deadly beauty, practiced, efficient, and quiet. Each mission began with a forward observer, sometimes perched in a church steeple, sometimes crawling through mud with binoculars. He'd spot a target, whisper the coordinates. In the Fire Direction Center, often by candlelight, men scribbled calculations. Wind, distance, charge, angle. Then came the order. Fire mission. Battery adjusts. Shell HE. Fuse quick. 4 howitzers barked in perfect unison. The roar became a single sound, one rolling wall of thunder. Shells landed seconds apart, detonating together. Hedgerows disappeared in flame. And then, silence. Even battle-hardened veterans were awed. A colonel from the 2nd Infantry Division later wrote, "When the 333rd fired, the ground didn't shake, it vanished." Each perfect barrage turned disbelief into respect. White infantrymen who might have sneered at them back home now prayed for their presence. When radios went dead and shellfire stopped, they'd shout through the trenches, "Get the 333rd on it. Those boys don't miss." But in the upper ranks, the realm of medals and headlines, the silence persisted. Their names rarely appeared in the communiques sent back to Washington. Commendations were quietly filed away. America still wasn't ready to celebrate black excellence. Yet for the men of the 333rd, fame wasn't the goal. Victory was. Every shell fired was one more truth hammered into history, that courage and competence weren't white inventions. And so, while the newspapers glorified other units, these men wrote their own record in blast patterns and crater maps. By October 1944, after 3 months of relentless combat, they had earned respect from every division they supported. They'd fired tens of thousands of shells, cleared towns, liberated villages. Their precision had saved hundreds of American lives. And then, just when it seemed they'd finally earned a moment of rest, the order came down. The 333rd was being reassigned to a quiet sector, a calm stretch of hills and pine forests along the Belgian border, the Ardennes. a place where, they were told, nothing ever happens. They set up near a small village called Schönberg, built huts, hung Christmas decorations, planned a concert. For the first time, peace seemed possible. But peace is an illusion in wartime. And in that illusion, the 333rd relaxed, unaware that the largest German offensive of the Western Front was about to crash down on them like an avalanche. December 1944. The Ardennes looked like a painting pine tree draped in snow, rivers frozen still, smoke curling lazily from Belgian chimneys. After months of combat, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion finally breathed. They built log huts, played cards, rehearsed for a Christmas concert. It was the first time they'd slept without the sound of gunfire in their dreams. Their new assignment near a small village called Schönberg was labeled a rest sector. Even the officers believed it. After all, the German army was supposedly broken, retreating across the Rhine. The war in Europe was almost over. At least, that's what everyone thought. But beneath that blanket of snow, something massive was stirring. At 5:30 a.m., on December 16th, the illusion shattered. The horizon didn't glow with sunrise, it exploded with fire. Thousands of German guns opened up at once, turning the forest into a furnace. Shells screamed through the dark, ripping trees out by the roots. Men were thrown from their bunks, grabbing helmets and boots as the ground itself convulsed. For 90 minutes, the bombardment never stopped. Then came silence, the kind soldiers dread. And through that silence came a new sound: engines, tracks, the metallic clatter of armor moving through the snow. 3 German armies, more than 250,000 men, were rolling straight toward them. It was Hitler's final gamble. The Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The 333rd found itself directly in the path of the attack. Nearby, the 106th Infantry Division Green, barely trained, was smashed apart within hours. Radio lines collapsed. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles. The fog was so thick that Allied planes couldn't fly. By dawn, the front line had disintegrated. At battalion headquarters, Master Sergeant Floyd Jones stared at his map in disbelief. "It can't be that bad," he muttered. But it was worse. The Germans weren't probing the line, they were flooding through it. At 8 a.m., orders came down from General McMahon: withdraw toward Bastogne, leave a detachment for covering fire. That decision sealed their fate. Batteries A and B hitched their howitzers and began the dangerous retreat west. But Battery C and the service battery stayed behind. Their mission: hold the line as long as possible. They knew exactly what that meant. Captain William McLeod, commanding Battery C, gathered his men. Snow fell in heavy silence as he spoke. "We stay. We hold. We keep firing until they tell us to stop, or we can't." At 9 a.m., their guns roared to life. The howitzers hurled shell after shell into the fog, slowing the German advance, buying precious minutes for retreating units. For every German round that fell, the 333rd sent 3 back. Smoke, snow, and courage. That was all they had left. By noon, ammunition was running low. The air reeked of powder. The snow had turned black with soot. Then came the rumble of engines, the first Panzer IVs, followed by Tiger tanks, crawling toward Schönberg. Battery C's forward observers called in coordinates. Target at 2,800 yards. Fire for effect. The howitzers answered. A shell slammed into the lead. Panzer fire erupted through its panzer. Hatches. Another exploded beside it, flipping a truck full of infantry. But for every tank they hit, 2 more appeared out of the mist. The Germans returned fire. Shells rained down on the gun positions. Trees shattered. Shrapnel whined through the air. One round struck the service battery, the one loaded with ammunition and fuel. The blast was apocalyptic. Trucks ignited like torches. The explosion lit up the snow as bright as daylight. "Get the wounded out! We can't move the guns! Keep firing!" The men fought like demons. Some shifted to direct fire, lowering the barrels of their howitzers and firing point blank at the oncoming tanks. Each recoil slammed the guns backward in the snow. They kept firing until the Germans were nearly on top of them. By dusk, communication was gone. Battery C surrounded. Service battery overrun. Schönberg lost. Captain McLeod was killed beside his gun, fighting to the last round. Technical Sergeant William Pritchett rallied survivors until a mortar shell ended his life. Private George Davis stayed at his post, refusing to abandon his gun. When German soldiers stormed the position, he was still their finger frozen on the trigger. By nightfall, the 333rd was shattered. 6 officers and 222 enlisted men were dead or captured. 9 howitzers destroyed. 34 trucks gone. It was the worst artillery loss in VIII Corps history, but 11 men escaped. Exhausted, frostbitten, armed with only 2 rifles between them, they slipped into the forest heading west, toward American lines. They trudged through waist-deep snow, following frozen creeks, guided by faith more than direction. Among them, Curtis Adams, Robert Greene, Thomas Forte, James Stewart, and others whose names would one day be etched into stone. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small Belgian hamlet, Wereth. A farmer named Matthias Langer opened his door. His wife Maria and their 12-year-old son Hermann stood behind him. The soldiers were starving, trembling, barely standing. Maria brought them food, blankets, warmth. For a few hours, the world was kind again. But peace doesn't last in war. A local neighbor sympathetic to Germany saw them enter the farmhouse. He slipped away through the snow and alerted a nearby SS patrol from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, one of the most feared and brutal units of the war. At dusk, the SS arrived. The 11 Americans surrendered quietly, hands raised. They were marched down the road out of sight. What happened next would remain buried in silence for 50 years. Snow fell softly over the Belgian hamlet of Wereth that night, a scene of perfect stillness masking the ugliest truth of war. Inside the Langer farmhouse, warmth flickered from the hearth. Maria Langer poured soup into tin bowls, her hands trembling slightly as she set them before the 11 American soldiers who'd stumbled through her door hours earlier. They were barely alive, clothes soaked, faces hollow, eyes glassy from exhaustion. One man, Private Curtis Adams, fell asleep mid-meal, spoon still in his hand. For the first time in days, they felt safe. For the first time since Schönberg, they were warm. But outside, in the darkness, betrayal was already moving toward them. A neighbor whose name history never bothered to preserve had watched them enter the farmhouse. He slipped through the snow, crossed a small ridge, and whispered to a German patrol, American soldiers, 11 of them, at the Langer house. The patrol he found wasn't ordinary Wehrmacht infantry. They were from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Men, hardened by years of brutality, indoctrinated by fanaticism. They were veterans of atrocities across Europe, from Poland to Kharkov, where surrender often meant nothing. At dusk, boots crunched on the snow outside the farmhouse. Hermann Langer, 12 years old, peered through the window. He saw shadows, rifles, helmets. His father stepped outside. The soldiers demanded the Americans. Inside, the men rose quietly. They didn't resist. They knew what capture meant, but they were unarmed, frostbitten, and too weak to run. They filed out one by one, hands raised. Maria stood frozen, tears streaking her face, as her son whispered, "Mama, will they be okay?" No one answered. The patrol marched them down the road past the church, across the frozen fields until the darkness swallowed them. The Langers never saw them alive again. Later that night, Maria said she heard distant gunfire, 11 sharp cracks echoing through the valley, then silence. 2 months later, when the snow finally thawed, villagers found them. 11 bodies, lying together in a field on the edge of town. Hands tied behind their backs, faces mutilated, fingers broken, legs shattered. Several had been shot in the head. Others stabbed or bayoneted. One had his jaw smashed, likely from a rifle butt. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The U.S. Army's Criminal Investigation Division documented everything. Witness statements, photographs, medical reports. The evidence was clear. This was a war crime, deliberate, methodical, and cruel. But justice never came. Unlike the Melamed massacre, where white American POWs were executed and the outrage led to dozens of trials and death sentences, the Wereth 11 case quietly vanished from official records. No one was charged. No SS officer was ever tried. The file was buried, labeled closed, insufficient evidence. One investigator later admitted privately there was no political interest in prosecuting crimes against Negro troops. The government wanted to move on. The message was unmistakable. In 1945, the United States Army still couldn't bring itself to fight racism on two fronts. The men of Wereth were forgotten not by time, but by indifference. Their names were left out of memorials. Their families received no letters, no medals, no mention in history books. They became ghosts. For decades, their story survived only in whispers in the memory of one boy who'd seen them that night. Hermann Langer, now a grown man, could never forget the faces of those soldiers sitting at his family's table. He remembered the way one of them thanked his mother in broken French before stepping outside. He remembered the silence that followed. In 1994, 50 years later, Hermann returned to the field where they had died. He carried a wooden cross and a small stone marker etched with 11 names. He planted it in the frozen earth and whispered a prayer. That single act of remembrance broke half a century of silence. Word spread across Belgium. Local historians began digging through archives. American veterans groups took notice. By the early 2000s, a movement had begun to restore the memory of the Wereth 11. 3 Belgian citizens, Marcel, Monique, and Hermann Schmetz, took up the cause. They raised funds, purchased the land, and began building a permanent memorial. It wasn't easy. They faced bureaucratic resistance, lack of funding, and even local skepticism. But they persisted. In 2004, exactly 60 years after the massacre, the Wereth Memorial was dedicated, a quiet field, a black granite monument, 11 names carved into stone. Curtis Adams, Major Bradley, George Davis Jr., Thomas Forte, Robert Green, James Leatherwood, Nathaniel Moss, George Motton, William Pritchett, James Stewart, Dew Turner. Each name representing a man who gave everything and asked for nothing. In the United States, recognition came even slower. Only in 2006 did a veterans group in Massachusetts build the first American memorial for the Wereth 11. And 10 years later, in 2016, the U.S. Senate finally passed Resolution 5771, officially recognizing their dedicated service and ultimate sacrifice. It had taken 72 years. One descendant of Private Robert Greene said during they fought for a flag that didn't fight for them, but maybe now people will finally say their names. Every year since, American and Belgian soldiers gather at Wereth. They lay wreaths, play taps, stand in silence as the wind moves through the grass, the same wind that once carried gunfire, because remembrance is justice. And silence, no matter how long, can be broken by a single act of memory. But while the world slowly rediscovered the 11 who died at Wereth, their surviving brothers of the 333rd were still fighting, this time in the frozen siege of Bastogne. They had lost half their men. They had every reason to quit. But they didn't. Because for them, the mission was never about medals or equality. It was about proving one thing, that excellence has no color. December 18th, 1944. The survivors of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion trudged through waist-deep snow, dragging what was left of their gear. Frost crusted their collars, their breath steaming in the air like ghosts. They had lost over half their men in the forests around Schönberg. Their brothers, the 11 from Wereth, were gone, but there was no time to mourn. The German tide was still rolling west, and the next name on its map was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. By the time the 333rd reached its outskirts, Bastogne was already chaos. Supply trucks jammed the roads. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne were digging frozen foxholes. Medics shouted for stretchers, radios hissed static, and snow mixed with smoke in the air. The town was about to become the center of the greatest siege of the Western Front. The 333rd joined forces with their sister unit, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, 2 black battalions, now forming the backbone of Bastogne's defense. 5 howitzers remained, patched together from wrecks and salvaged parts. Their barrels were worn smooth from months of combat. But the men were determined. They had something to prove to the enemy and to history itself. They positioned their guns in a defensive arc, south and east of Bastogne, digging them into the frozen soil. Forward observers crawled through snow with binoculars, sharing foxholes with the paratroopers of Easy Company. They called them the Invisible Guns because no one ever saw them, only their work. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded 45,000 Germans encircling 18,000 Americans. Every road in and out was cut. Supplies gone. Ammunition dwindling. The temperature dropped below zero. Frostbite took fingers before bullets did. In the cellar of a half-destroyed convent, the American commanders gathered around a lantern. A German courier arrived with a white flag delivering an ultimatum. To the commander of Bastogne, surrender honorably to avoid annihilation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe scrawled his reply on a scrap of paper. Nuts. One word. That word meant everything. Bastogne would hold or die, trying. And for Bastogne to hold, the 333rd had to keep firing. Every morning, German artillery pounded the town. Every afternoon, panzers rolled forward through the drifts. And every time, the men of the 333rd answered, "Fire mission, high explosive, fuse, quick!" The order echoed through the blizzard. The guns fired. The recoil threw snow and ice into the air like shrapnel. Casings hissed as they hit the frozen ground. In the candle-lit fire direction center, men hunched over maps and slide rules. Wind speed, elevation, charge. Each number had to be perfect. There was no room for error, not when ammunition was down to 10 shells per gun, per day. Every shot had to count. Outside, crews worked in pairs, their hands bleeding from handling steel shells in sub-zero air. They poured melted snow over the hot barrels to cool them, the steam rising in ghostly columns. Their breath came in gasps, visible in the flare of every muzzle blast. The sound was endless. Thunder relentless. Steady, professional. A paratrooper from the 101st later said, "When those black gunners opened up, it felt like God himself was answering." German records confirm it. Captured officers wrote in disbelief, "Their artillery is devastatingly accurate. These cannot be the inferior troops our propaganda described." That single sentence, pulled from a German diary, was worth more than any medal. The Nazi myth of racial superiority had just been shattered by 95-pound shells. The siege dragged on. Food ran out. Each man got a handful of crackers and half a can of beans a day. They melted snow for water, reused coffee grounds 3 times. Sleep came in 2-hour shifts if it came at all. Still, the guns never stopped. Private George Motton wrote in his notebook, "The cold hurts worse than the shells. But we keep firing. The shells are our answer." By December 22nd, the Germans broke through to within 300 yards of some gun positions. At that range, artillery became direct fire. Imagine it, a weapon designed to lob shells miles away, now aiming point-blank at tanks you could see through the snow. Motton sighted one through the fog. A loader rammed the shell into the breech. Fuse, super-quick detonation. The lanyard snapped. The shell crossed the field in less than a second impact. Explosion, fireball. The next shot took a troop carrier. The third, a machine gun nest. They fired until nothing moved. When the Germans countercharged, the gunners grabbed rifles and fought like infantry. When their rifles jammed, They went back to their howitzers. It wasn't strategy anymore, it was survival. On Christmas Eve, the sky finally cleared for the first time in a week. German bombers appeared overhead, dropping explosives that ripped through the town and killed dozens, including Captain Ray Chappell of Battery B. But that same clear sky brought salvation. At dawn, the rumble of engines filled the air, not tanks, but C-47 transport planes. Parachutes opened like white flowers against the gray. Supplies, food, ammunition, hope, falling from heaven. Private Samuel Ellis of the 969th later wrote in a letter home, "It's Christmas. We're hungry, frozen, and surrounded, but we're still here." Tell everyone back home when it mattered most, the black artillerymen stood and fought. 3 days later, on December 26th, the ground began to shake again, but this time it wasn't German shells. It was the sound of engines rolling up from the south. General Patton's Third Army had broken through. The siege was over. Bastogne had held. For their precision and courage, both the 333rd and 969th received the Presidential Unit Citation, the first ever awarded to black combat units in Europe. The commendation read, "For extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy." Despite overwhelming odds and severe conditions, these units delivered fire of the highest accuracy and effectiveness, contributing decisively to the defense of Bastogne. But there were no parades, no ticker tape, no headlines. When the men returned to camp, they were still segregated. Separate tents, separate meals, separate everything. They'd helped save Europe, but they still couldn't sit at the same table as the soldiers they'd protected. Yet, among the paratroopers and infantry, respect ran deep. A veteran of the 101st later said, "When we heard those guns, we knew we weren't alone. We didn't care what color they were, only that they never missed." The 333rd's men didn't fight for gratitude. They fought for the principle behind the flag, even when that flag didn't fully fight for them. As the snow melted and the smoke cleared, the truth was undeniable. The men once dismissed as unfit for combat had held one of the most important lines of the entire war. Their discipline had broken the German offensive. Their precision had saved thousands of lives. Their courage had rewritten the script of prejudice. They hadn't just defended Bastogne. They'd defended America's conscience. When the last German shell fell silent over Bastogne, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion didn't cheer. They didn't have the energy. They simply lowered their guns, slumped against the trails, and stared at the frozen horizon where fire and snow had blended into one gray sky. They'd survived, barely. Of the original 540 men who'd entered the Ardennes, fewer than 300 were still standing. Most were frostbitten, many were wounded, all were exhausted. Their howitzers were scarred and warped from overuse. Their trucks looked like skeletons of metal and mud. But they had done what no one thought possible. They'd held Bastogne. And they had done it while carrying the weight of two wars, one against the enemy outside the wire, and one against the prejudice within their own ranks. In the months that followed, the 333rd was reconstituted and sent forward again, supporting the Allied push into Germany. They crossed rivers, shelled retreating positions, and cleared roads for Patton's advance. By April 1945, they'd earned multiple campaign stars and the Presidential Unit Citation. It was the Army's highest collective honor. But when victory finally came, when Europe celebrated and church bells rang across the continent, the men of the 333rd didn't march under arches of triumph. They packed their gear, boarded troop trucks, and drove quietly to the ports. When they stepped off the ships back home, there were no brass bands, no waiting crowds, no handshakes. They were sent to separate disembarkation zones, black troops to one side, white to another. Even the trains that carried them home ran on segregation. At some bases, white soldiers were greeted with parades and music. The 333rd's men were told to line up quietly for processing. Then they were dismissed. Just like that, invisible again. One veteran, Master Sergeant Floyd Jones, later said in an interview. "We fought the Germans for democracy, but we couldn't sit next to a white man on the bus home." The bitter irony wasn't lost on any of them. They had faced down Tiger tanks and elite SS units, yet, in uniform, in their own country, they were still called boy. Some couldn't even vote in their hometowns. Others returned to jobs that refused to hire them because of the color of their skin. Still, they carried themselves with quiet pride. They didn't need parades to know what they'd done. They had fired until their hands bled. They had held a city the world thought would fall, and they had buried their own in snow-covered fields, far from home. For them, victory wasn't about glory. It was about dignity. After the war, the 333rd was officially inactivated. Its lineage was absorbed into the Army Reserve as the 446th Field Artillery Battalion, headquartered in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1959, it was reorganized again as the 333rd Artillery Regiment, a symbolic resurrection of the unit that had been written out of history. Its crest tells their story better than any book. At its center, a golden Belgian lion symbol of the land they defended. Behind it, a red and blue shield, the colors of Bastogne. 5 notches along its edge represent 5 major campaigns. And crowning the design, a sword breaker, a medieval weapon that shatters blades. Its meaning, to break the enemy's power. It was a fitting emblem for men who shattered prejudice with precision. But recognition for their service true, national recognition took decades. Through the 40s and 50s, history books wrote about Bastogne, but not about the artillery behind it. Films showed the paratroopers, the generals, the headlines, but the 333rd's name was nowhere to be found. Even the massacre at Wereth was erased from official archives. When veterans of the unit applied for decorations, many were denied. When families asked for details of their loved ones' deaths, the Army sent back one-line letters: missing in action, presumed deceased, nothing more. Their story faded into silence. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was inconvenient. In an America still segregated by law, telling the truth about black heroism meant confronting hypocrisy. For 20 years, that silence held. But time has a way of uncovering buried truth. And sometimes, it takes one act of memory, a wooden cross in a Belgian field, to reignite history. Because while the soldiers of the 333rd returned to a divided country, the world they had helped liberate had not forgotten them completely. In Belgium, that small farmhouse in Wereth still stood, and the boy who once opened its door to freezing soldiers still remembered their faces. For 50 years, the story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion existed only in fragments, a few forgotten reports, a handful of veterans' memories, and one boy's unshakable conscience. That boy was Hermann Langer, the 12-year-old son of the Belgian farmer who had offered the 11 Americans food and shelter in the winter of 1944. As he grew into an old man, Hermann never forgot their faces, their exhaustion, their quiet dignity, the way one of them thanked his mother before stepping out into the snow. He'd spent his life haunted not by the horror of what happened, but by the silence that followed. In the spring of 1994, 50 years after that night, Hermann walked back into the same field where the men had died. The grass had grown tall. The hills were peaceful again. He carried a wooden cross, hand-carved, and a small stone marker engraved with 11 names. He planted them into the soil alone and whispered a prayer. "You are not forgotten." That simple act broke the silence history had tried to keep. Word spread across Belgium. Local teachers began telling their students about the Wereth 11. Newspapers printed small stories. American veterans groups, some of them paratroopers from Bastogne, recognized the names, and slowly, a movement began. In the early 2000s, 3 Belgian citizens, Marcel, Monique, and Hermann Schmetz, took up the cause. They organized fundraisers, wrote letters, and even used their own savings to buy the small plot of land where the 11 men had been murdered. They worked with the Langer family to create a permanent memorial, not grand or political, but quiet and human, like the men themselves. And on May 23, 2004, exactly 60 years after the massacre, the Wereth Memorial was unveiled. A black granite monument stood on the same field where snow had once covered the bodies. 11 names, carved deep enough to last forever: Curtis Adams, Major Bradley, George Davis, Junior Thomas Forte, Robert Greene, James Leatherwood, Nathaniel Moss, George Motton, William Pritchett, James Stewart, Dew Turner. The dedication ceremony was simple. A Belgian priest offered a blessing. American and Belgian flags were raised side by side. Children from local schools laid flowers, and then came the sound of taps, soft, trembling, carried by the wind. For the first time in 6 decades, those 11 names were spoken aloud. 1. U.S. Veteran present that day said quietly, "It's like they finally came home." Recognition crossed the Atlantic slowly, but it came. In 2006, a veterans chapter in Massachusetts erected the first American monument to the Wereth 11. A decade later, in 2016, the United States Senate passed Resolution 5771, officially recognizing their dedicated service and ultimate sacrifice. That same year, the House introduced Resolution 43, ensuring their story would be recorded in the congressional record. It had taken 72 years for their country to say their names, but even that was not the end. In 2020, during the global pandemic, American diplomats in Belgium still traveled to that field in Wereth. No crowds, no cameras, just snow, silence, and respect. They laid a wreath, bowed their heads, and read the names again. Even in isolation, remembrance endured. Each December since, soldiers from the U.S. and Belgium have returned to that same field. They stand in formation under gray skies, the wind cold against their faces. There are no speeches, only silence and gratitude, because remembrance is more than ceremony. It's correction, it's history, finding its voice again. And yet, the legacy of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion extends far beyond a single monument. In the decades after the war, their precision and professionalism helped dismantle one of America's most enduring injustices: segregation in the military. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, declaring, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." Many historians now trace the roots of that order to the performance of units like the 333rd. Their battlefield excellence made segregation not only immoral, but militarily indefensible. In private memos, even War Department officials admitted it. Negro artillery units have performed with distinction and unmatched discipline. The data spoke louder than prejudice. In the Army, performance is everything, and the 333rd had delivered perfection under fire. Still, for the men who lived it, justice came too late to feel like victory. Many returned home to the same signs they'd left behind, white only. Some couldn't find work, others were denied G.I. Bill benefits through technicalities that seemed anything but accidental. But they didn't protest. They had proven their point where it mattered most in the field, under fire, when the world was watching. Master Sergeant Floyd Jones summed it up years later. "We knew we were fighting two enemies, the Germans and racism at home. We won the first war in 45. The second one took longer, but we won that too." And he was right. They didn't win through speeches or politics. They won by example, one calculation, one shell, one act of quiet discipline at a time. Today, if you visit the Wereth Memorial, there are no billboards pointing the way. Just a small wooden sign by the roadside that reads, "Monument des Soldats Americans." The path is lined with birch trees, their branches whispering in the wind. At the end of the path stands the black stone monument, flanked by the flags of two nations. Visitors stand quietly. Soldiers, students, families. They read the names, They take off their hats. And for a moment, the air feels heavy, as if the past itself is watching. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the distant rhythm of artillery, the heartbeat of the 333rd, echoing through time.